Hello, this is the second video lesson for the Argumentative Google Docs essay. Now, as far as this particular video, we are going to be discussing the two structural options that you have for the essay itself. Now, in order to find your two structural options, I want to encourage you to go to the Canvas modules page, and you're going to look for Module 22 right here, and it's the Argumentative Google Docs outline templates. Now, you have two options here, B and C. And I want to go to our modules page to ensure you know where to find that. Here's our modules page. You're going to notice 22. There's option 1 or there's option 2. Now you notice you're going to click on the actual module just like I'm doing. Okay. And you're going to see that you have a worksheet. Now, you can download either of these worksheets depending on which structure you choose, and all you do is you essentially type in your content. It's going to make this much easier for you to complete this essay, okay? Now, as far as the options, okay, they're very similar. The only difference is where you place the oppositional viewpoint, okay? Now, as far as the two structures, okay, I have very brief overviews of them in this particular PowerPoint where I overview their structures, but also in the handout that I gave you earlier. Remember this handout right here, the Argumentative Google Docs handout. Remember we went over the annotated bibliography, also mentioned some things about the essay, and I mentioned the structural options. Now, if you notice on page 3 and also on page 4, these overview those two different structures in detail, okay? So you may want to reference these. Now, I am going to mention some of this information in relationship to the PowerPoint. Now, the PowerPoint version, it has two sets of slides that just kind of overview the structure as a whole, and you're going to notice option 1, which is the letter B on Canvas. You essentially are going to be discussing your introduction, and then you're going to talk about your two reasons in 2 paragraphs of why you agree or disagree with this particular type of technology. And you, of course, break down your reasons, you elaborate upon them, you have your own research to expand upon it from your sources. And then notice your last body paragraph is where you go into your oppositional viewpoint, okay? And that's where you acknowledge the other side's stance. You also give evidence from their viewpoint. And also you go into your reasons why you disagree with their stance and give your own evidence to elaborate upon that. And then of course you end on your conclusion paragraph. Now notice this is the first structure. The first structure, you go your stance first in 2 paragraphs, your body paragraphs, and then the last paragraph or paragraphs, because you can break this up into 2, is the other side's viewpoint and your reason for disagreeing with it. Now as far as for the second option, this is in letter C. For letter C, all you're doing is you're flipping it, okay? Now, what I mean by flipping it is you're going to discuss after the introduction paragraph the oppositional viewpoint, what the other side's argument is, their evidence, why you disagree with them, and use that kind of as a springboard into your 2 stances. Notice essentially your 4th paragraph would be your first stance. Your 5th paragraph would be your second stance, like your second reason for agreeing or disagreeing with this particular type of technology, and then your conclusion paragraph. And you're going to notice in the PowerPoint and also in the handout that I gave y'all, and remember this particular handout, if you've forgotten about it, this was the very first handout I gave you on the actual research project. Remember it overviewed the annotated bibliography. It also overviewed some of the information regarding the essay, and I mentioned the structural options. Essentially, page 3 and page 4, these break down all of these different types of structures, and it lets you know exactly what information you need to put in each of these. Now, I want to use first option 1 as sort of an example because you have a student example that uses this, but also I want us to kind of look at the PowerPoint as well. Now, you're going to notice I break down each part of the outline so you understand what all this terminology is. Like, for example, your introduction, that section, that is where you're going to be placing your introductory lead-in device. You need to have something that's an attention getter, a hook to get your readers just intrigued in your research topic. I mean, it might be a question, it may be a definition, it may be a statistic, an overview of a study from one of your sources. It might be a quote from someone that's very important to your topic, like the creator of that particular technology. But get us interested. You also need to have some type of bridge or transitional sentences to connect and then lead into your thesis statement. And remember, your thesis statement, it can be generalized where you just overview your stance and, that technology, or it can be the 2 or 3 point thesis that overviews your reason or reasons for agreeing or disagreeing with that particular stance. Now, if you look at the student example, you'll notice the student example here, it uses option 1. And I want you to notice how this student structures his introduction. He opens up with information from his source. Now remember, his essay topic was on genetically modified foods. So this is his introduction. Over 90% of America's 3 major crops are currently, I think he meant grown. He put gown. So grown using GM seeds. So this was from one of his sources, an article called Health Risk. Now he wanted to inform his reader, so he gives information from the source, but also he educates his reader. GM means that these seeds were altered using genetic engineering, referring to the process of editing the genetic material of an organism. The goal of genetically engineering seeds is to create plants that have the best characteristics possible for growing in certain conditions. Growing GM foods is becoming increasingly popular among farmers due to their economic benefits despite claims of foods being safe. Now again, this introduction, it kind of serving a purpose of educating the reader. Many readers may not really know what GM foods are, and this particular writer wanted to educate his readers about them. That's something you can do with your introduction paragraph, is you can educate your reader. Then notice he goes into his thesis. Now his thesis very clearly, notice, mentions his topic, GM foods, but also he overviews his 2 reasons that he supports GM foods. He says GM foods help farmers attempt to keep up with the hunger of an increasing population, so that's his first reason, and create less strain on valuable natural resources. That's his second reason. Now, you can have a thesis statement like this, okay, where you actually physically list your 2 reasons, or you can have a thesis statement, a major claim that just in general overviews that you agree or disagree with the particular technology you're discussing. Now, moving on to the next structure, you're going to notice that the next structure in option 1 is you're going into your first body paragraph. And in option 1, this is where you're discussing your stance, your opinion. Claim 1, that is just a topic sentence. It overviews your first reason for overviewing your support or opposition of the technology. You may have another sentence or 2 after that are kind of sentences of expansion or elaboration, you explaining that particular idea in more detail. Then, of course, you have to have evidence. You need a quote or paraphrase from your source or sources. You can have one quote, or if you want to have a quote from one source and then another quote from another source. You can have several under there to support your opinion that you just stated. Then just don't expect for your reader to understand how that quote, which might be a statistic or a fact, how it connects or explains your claim. You've got to make connections. That's where the explanation is. You're explaining how or why that quote or paraphrase explains or elaborates on your idea. And you're going to notice the student example. In the student example, this is his first paragraph. He says as his first claim, GM seeds are a step towards ending world hunger. With Earth's population expected to reach 10 billion by the year 2050, current crop production will not be able to meet the demands of consumers. So he's kind of addressing a problem, and now he's going to go into why GM foods are the solution. You can use problem-solution structures, cause and effect in this essay. An article published in the Penn State Ag Science magazine says the world will need to produce 70% more food to keep up with this growth. That statistic neglects to mention the 795 million people who are presently undernourished. So he's educating us about what the problem is and also how GM foods can solve this particular problem. And then notice he has further evidence to actually act as a supporting kind of piece of evidence or proof of why GM foods could help alleviate this issue. GM crops have allowed an average increase in agriculture yield by 22%, okay? And that's, of course, his article title where he found it. Now, he couldn't just end on that quote. He has to elaborate and explain how that quote proved his argument of why GM foods could help world hunger. He says, since the introduction of GM food crops almost 20 years ago, the average crop yield is 22%. With further development, this could continue to increase, meaning GM crops play a crucial role in feeding the world. The increase in crop yields helps more than just the Earth's inhabitants. So you're going to notice he explained himself. Think of this as a paragraph full circle. It should be able to kind of stand on its own where it's a whole argument that's in a paragraph. You should be able to take it out of your essay and it makes sense by itself. Now, of course, this is just one paragraph. You have to have a second paragraph that overviews your stance or opinion. Now, in option 1, your essentially third paragraph is going to be your second claim, your second reason for supporting or opposing this particular type of technology. In the same manner, you're going to have claim 2, which is your topic sentence, overviewing your second reason for supporting or opposing the topic. Feel free to use more sentences to expand upon that idea. Evidence, quote, or paraphrase from one or several of your sources, and then your explanation of how that quote approves that point that you just made. And again, we're going to look at the student's essay to explain. Okay, in the student essay, his claim 2 is essentially going to be discussing his second reason, okay? His second reason for supporting GM crops is this: widespread use of GM seeds creates less strain on the Earth's natural resources. So not only does he think it's going to help alleviate world hunger, he thinks it's going to be less of a strain on the Earth's resources. An increase in crop yield means farmers can produce more food on less land, a valuable natural resource. Not all land is arable, so making the most out of available arable land is important. On another note, GM plants can decrease pesticide use and water consumption. Now, you're going to notice he can't just leave like his, claim 2 without evidence. So essentially what he does, and I'm not going to read you this whole, quote, he essentially has a quote from a writer named Sims. And Sims essentially argues that genetic modification can essentially make plants more resistant to not only insects, but also to drought. And this whole paragraph from a source discusses that. Now, he can't just leave his paragraph with that evidence. He has to explain himself. And notice in his explanation of evidence 2, he says, a decrease in pesticide use is appealing to consumers because of claims that runoff from pesticide-coated farms can harm the environment. In regards to drought resistance, farmers that worry about rainfall often irrigate their crops so they can water the crops themselves. Crops that can resist droughts will require much less artificial watering and save another valuable resource. So again, this ends his overview of his 2 claims. Now, he can't finish his essay here. He has to be an ethical arguer and overview the other side stance. This is the oppositional viewpoint. In this case, it would be those that disagree with genetically modified foods. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Now, sadly, I think this particular section of students' essays can be somewhat confusing to them. But again, just make sure that you understand. You are going to essentially overview collectively what the other stance's side is. Now, in the GM Foods essay that we're looking at, that student writer, he supports GM Foods, but he has to have a topic sentence that overviews the other side, which in that case, it would be the side who disagree with the usage of GM foods. And you're going to notice in the student essay, he does that, okay? Right here, his oppositional claim, it overviews collectively those who disagree with him. He says, for large numbers of consumers, the benefits are not enough to waive their concerns. Claims that GM foods can negatively affect human health are the main reason behind consumer concern. So he overviews why many people disagree with their usage, even though maybe they could alleviate world hunger, they could disagree, decrease ultimately like natural resources, ultimately, there's individuals that don't agree with GM food usage because there's it's a new technology, it could harm people as a whole, and he acknowledges that. He overviews collectively that oppositional viewpoint. But he can't just leave it at that. You're going to notice in the PowerPoint, the next section is the oppositional evidence. You need to have a specific quote or quotes. You could have one or several from individuals, writers who have that same stance. That stance that disagrees with yours. And you'll notice in his particular essay, he has this particular source that is the other side's argument. Several animal studies indicate serious health risk associated with genetically modified food, including infertility, immune problems, accelerated aging, faulty insulin regulation, and changes in major organs and gastrointestinal system. So he found a source that actually discussed the possible health effects, negative ones at that could affect humans if they consume GM foods. So again, this goes against his opinion, okay? But he has to acknowledge that, listen, not everybody agrees with his opinion on supporting genetically modified foods. This is the other side's viewpoint. This is why they disagree with them. But guess what? he can point out why he disagrees with their stance. And that's what we're going to look at next. And next is a rebuttal, which we'll be discussing in the next video. Thanks.